Hello, this is Jim Luken. Today we're going to be looking at this Dri-Dek flooring and going to attempt to install this in my Seaark boat. I got this stuff for about $6 a square foot. Bought it directly from the manufacturer. Got it in the matching color of my boat, which I think is kind of cool. And so I got my various tools here. I got a box cutting knife, I got some clippers, I got a little hammer. These are all the tools that people who came before me with videos suggested you might need to do the install. So one of the first things that I did before I ordered this stuff is I took some crude measurements of the main floor of my boat, sort of did it in sections, added some area below the console, and actually added a little extra in case I wanted to put this stuff in the compartments of my boat in case the stuff worked out really well. And when it was all said and done, I needed about 48 square feet. I ordered a 50 square foot box of this stuff just so I'd had a little extra in case I screwed things up. And as I said before, total cost was about $6 a square foot. So I spent a few moments just sort of looking at the main floor of my boat to try to figure out where the problems are going to happen. And right off the bat I saw that I had to make a decision here. These captain's chairs have a big base plate, and the base plate sits on sort of a round pedestal. So I'm going to have to decide whether to go to here or go to here. That's the first decision. Around the edges, not a very big deal, although I have to admit in this Seaark boat there's an L-shaped bracket here that raises up a little bit, so what I'll probably have to do there is go to the edge and then trim the bottom nubs off so that it lays flat. And then of course around the console might be a little tricky since I'm going to have to make a corner right here, but it doesn't look like it's going to be that big of a deal. So from an installation perspective, the only real concern I have is once I put this stuff in, I want it to fit nice and tight because it's not tied down in any way. And what I certainly don't want to happen is for wind to get under it as I'm going down the road with the trailer and blow the stuff out. So hopefully that won't be a problem. So step one, I tried to get fancy and find the center line of the floor, but then I realized that that's not really necessary because the way these tiles work is they lay out in a very specific manner, and each one has to be laid out in the same way from where you start. And I don't know whether you can see this or not, but there's a little word right there that says Dri-Dek. And so when you start to lay these things out, just make sure that each successive tile has that word oriented in the same way. So I just went across the back, and then I'm going to have to deal with a little bit of extra over there. So you don't really need a hammer or anything special to press the tab into the hole. Really, all you need to do is center it over the hole and press it in with your finger, and you can hear it kind of snap into place. So that's really quite easy. So one of the things that I did that was very helpful was that I laid those tiles out in just sort of a temporary way to get a sense of where the seams were going to fall, whether I had enough tiles, and how I might orient that very first line. This is why or how I was able to determine that this seam up here needed to shift over a little bit so that I wouldn't have a little sliver of tile along the edge here. So lay them all out in sort of a temporary fashion first before you start cutting and snapping things together. So after playing around with this a bit, I finally came to the conclusion that probably the easiest and most effective way to make these pieces fit, just to lay them down and then cut them in place with this knife. Now we're up to day 2. I worked out here pretty much half the day, and I got about halfway done, and let me just say, this is not a fun project. First off, it was hot as could be out here in the South Carolina sun, but it's really tedious work. You're on your knees, you're bent over, you're making little tedious cuts, and I eventually just called it quits, getting about halfway done. And the problem was, of course, I started in the back here, had to go around these chairs, and it was just tedious work. And the other problem, of course, is these tiles only fit together in one way. And so when you're out here working and you're laying these things down, you have to be hyper vigilant about making sure you lay these things down in the right direction, making sure the little Dri-Dek embossed words are all oriented in the same way. And the other problem, of course, is if they only fit together in one way, you cut off a lot and waste a lot. And so I'm hoping I'm going to have enough tile to finish this job, but we'll just have to wait and see. So hopefully today I'm going to finish this thing off, but it hasn't been fun. So when you start to get to the end of your project and you're coming to the front up here, it's a good idea just to go ahead and lay out the tiles just to see how things are lining up. And I noticed that this gap over here was not perfect. What you can do, however, is come over here with your foot and kind of kick things a little bit and bring them into line. And so you can sort of make some adjustments with your foot once you get everything snapped together. And as you can see, all I got to do is deal with this area up here, make a few cuts around the console. All right, well, we're down to the finish line. I got one final line to trim to fill up that last gap, and I was able to count exactly how many tiles I need to finish the job, and the number is 6. I just looked in the box, and guess how many I counted? 6. So this is a cautionary tale. When you buy your tiles, make sure you buy extra, because as I said before, you waste a lot doing the trimming. Alright, well, we have everything pretty much roughed in for the first time. Things look pretty good. However, there's a couple little places around the edges where I've got some buckling, and I think perhaps if I just trim off a little bit around the edges here and there, I'll get the whole thing to lay out flat. So just a few more little adjustments, and we'll just about have this thing done. So a couple little last minute points. I got everything laid in here, but there were these bubbles around. The tiles weren't laying flat, and I think it was because I was too conservative cutting around the edges. And so what I had to do eventually at the very end was to apply some carpet laying techniques. So I sort of got off the ground and pushed everything to the front. And when I did that and lifted that front edge up, I was able to then go in there and cut off about a ½ inch of tile. And the reason why I needed to do that was because everything was just too tight and it was bunching up. And so once I sort of got my weight off there and kicked things forward and then trimmed that final edge, I was able to let everything sort of slide forward and everything kind of laid down nicely. So if you get to the end and you got the bubbling up places, don't worry. Get your weight off there and kind of kick it all forward and then trim it off so the thing can settle down into the floor of the boat. I'm finally done with this project, this installation of Dri-Dek in my Seaark aluminum boat. It took me 2 days to get this thing done, and I'm going to tell you again, this was not an easy or an enjoyable project. There was a lot of fitting and cutting and positioning and chasing down bubbles and repositioning and so on and so forth. But I finally got it in here, and I think it looks pretty good. Just a couple of points I want to reiterate. When you're laying those tiles down, pay extra attention to the orientation of them, because they only go in one way. And secondly, using this cutting knife, be really careful, because there's a lot of cutting and a lot of places where you can slice a finger. I managed not to slice my finger at all here, but I'm telling you, a lot of cutting, and so be careful with the cutting knife. So I hope this video has been helpful, and if you do install this Dri-Dek, I hope you'll find this video will make your install a little easier and maybe even a little more successful. Thank you, and this is Jim Luken.